The government is working at positioning the Post Bank to function as a full services bank. Public hearings were held last week as part of the process to amend the South African Post Bank Limited Act to insert the necessary changes to allow the bank to transition. Now, presenting the South African Post Bank Amendment Bill before the Communications Portfolio Committee yesterday, Communications Minister Khumbudzo Ntshavheni said the Post Office is not financially viable and therefore cannot hold a bank license despite being the shareholder and the owner of the Post Bank. SAPO is not different from other SOEs, and senior partner and governance specialist at SIDA, Roger Hitchcock, joins us now virtually to discuss the state of SOEs in South Africa. Roger, good to have you. Thanks very, very much for joining us.
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers.
It's an absolute pleasure. So let's start off with SAPO. It's been bedeviled by financial challenges for more than a decade now. The entity's problems have gotten so bad that it actually fails to meet its financial obligations, including its inability to even pay employees' pensions. And it has been the case with Denel, when it could not pay salaries. What is your own analysis of what's happening with SOEs in the country, whether we're talking Denel, Eskom, SAA, the list goes on?
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously all seen what's happened with the Zondo Commission, and in a sense, not wanting to review and relook at that, but essentially it's understanding how entities are governed. And I think one of the challenges we've seen with a lot of those is the nature of the boards in place in those different entities, and the nature of the board is instrumental in the success of any entity. And so we've obviously all heard about how boards were appointed, and listening to some of those hearings, too often in South Africa, I think we have very good frameworks, we have very good policies and thinking, but the pragmatics, how it's actually put into place, and often I think the understanding of directors is a challenge in fulfilling their governance role as part of those entities. The Post Bank, I think, or Post Office particularly, I think one of the challenges there has been that the fundamental business model of postal services has changed around the world in the last 15 or 20 years. And I think repositioning it has been really, really difficult. And there have been various people involved and various influences and interferences, which I think have been challenging to manage. Yeah.
So when we look at, I mean, the extent of political interference, because I think that's kind of something that many people talk to, and we look at these respective entities, and political interference is always one of those contributing factors to what we see happening in SOEs. I mean, also, if you have to take into consideration the revelations that have been made at the State Capture Commission, is this perhaps the biggest issue that one has to look at and understand what's going on at SOEs?
I do think so. I think there's another word which I think is really, really important to understand when one is sitting on a board. And that is, or the question, that is, whose interests am I here to serve? And I think in the public sector, that's another important word, that people serve on a board. We often think people sit on a board to dominate, but actually there's a serving. And ultimately, directors, individually and collectively, have one key role, and that is to serve the interests of the entity they are governing. And obviously, they are put there through different mechanisms, appointing mechanisms. But ultimately, if a board doesn't align around that issue of we are here to serve the entity, which ultimately in the public sector is there to serve South Africans, postal services, communication, Denel, defense of the country, Eskom, keep the lights on. That's the critical thing to think about. And as soon as we interfere with interests, someone who's appointed with a different purpose, with a different understanding, has mixed interests. And that's why in governance, managing conflict of interest is a critical issue to think about. And I think that's one of the things that directors need to understand is, what are we here to do? What is our role? It's there to serve the interests of this entity that we are accountable for governing. That makes sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, but there is the issue of cadre deployment, and this is where, yes, of course, you do have directors that are there to serve the best interests of the entity and to serve the best interests of the people, but that doesn't seem to be the theme, and it looks like things are to a point where it is more personal gain than country gain. What do you
Absolutely.
say about
you just use the word gain. I mean, that's essentially what I mean by the word interest. Is ultimately who are we there for? Cadre deployment, dangerous because it's another set of interests into the room. Personal gain, I'm sitting there for the fees I get. I'm thinking myself before I'm thinking of the entity. I think one way to think about it is that ultimately, if I serve as a board on a public sector entity, the first criteria should be, do I love the country I'm serving? Secondly, do I have the skills to direct? And thirdly, can I work with anybody? Because that's important when we work as a team, is that a board is a team of people that together need to govern an entity. And the governance of the entity allows it to operate. And I have no doubt that there are scores, thousands of highly competent, capable people in South Africa in the public sector that are being criticized, not for their own lack of capability or competence, but because they're not being governed well in that context. I'm not sure if that makes sense, yeah?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it does indeed. I mean, Minister Mthobeni said one of the issues raised in the public hearings were with regard to the powers of the minister to appoint the board and his or her approval of the CEO and the CFO. I mean, which she defended by clarifying that the appointments are not on a minister's whim, but there are processes to follow. What then explains the downtrodden state of these entities?
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think there are clear frameworks and guidelines, and the principle being in any entity is ultimately you have a body, a group of people or a party that can appoint the board. The key thing, though, is that appointment process doesn't create a relationship between them and the board, because the board is already put into a legal relationship with the entity. Fiduciary relationship to act in the best interest of the entity. And not understanding that separation of how I'm appointed and who I represent. In the boardroom, you represent the entity that you are a director of. I do think that one of the big challenges we have in the public sector, and we work as SADAR throughout Africa, is that there is this link between the shareholder, the public shareholder, which essentially is all of us, if we think about it, and the CEO or the functional or operational roles in an entity. I think if I allude to SABC had to walk its own journey with regard to that. And that link is not a healthy one, because in principle, the appointing party should appoint the board to ultimately serve the interests of the entity, best interests of the company, and that body of people, the board, should be able to appoint and performance manage the CEO, MD, and through them, the senior management team. And so that's the difference between governance and management, or governance and operations. And so separating those roles is absolutely critical in any entity, public sectors especially, but we see the same thing in shareholder driven entities as well, or in inverted commas controlled entities. And getting that right, I think some of our frameworks work. In listening to that explanation, there was very good defense, as you said, of that explanation of the appointment of the board and the CEO. Lots of criteria in banking, so they have to play by the rules. Yeah. But the pragmatics and the perspective of the person being appointed is critical, because if I think as the CEO that I'm not there to be accountable to the board, but ultimately I have this kind of backdoor to the minister who represents the shareholder, then it's going to nullify the power of the board and the authority of the board. And that's the problem we have.
And we've seen it time and time again, and that's the reality. Yeah. And we heard it firsthand. I mean, we sat listening to years of state capture stories and information coming out where you hear these kind of things. You mentioned the SABC in your answer as well, and that's a question that I'd like to ask you now. I mean, the SABC is sitting without a board. We haven't had a board since the middle of last month, and we're running in our news story now that there are still, of the 34 candidates, 6 still need to be vetted by the state security, and it's taking time. But I mean, this shouldn't be right, should it? That we, an entity that is operating without a board.
Yeah. But what it illustrates, Leanne, and this is possibly a good illustration, so I'm going to dive in here and say that what it shows is that an entity can operate in a sense, independently. It's not right, it's not good, it's not healthy, it's not sustainable. But the board was dysfunctional previously and has been able to, but right now is operating without a board because it's almost easier to operate, and there's an empowerment to operate without a board than with a dysfunctional board. And that's been the problem in all of our state-owned enterprises, or a lot of them. Let me not say all of them. Where the board is dysfunctional, it incapacitates and it disenables, if those are words, the functionings. Whereas remove that board for a time, and we have an entity like the SABC that is walking again, and can't carry on for too long. But the key thing is to move forward and get that board finalised, because that's absolutely critical to the sustainability of the entity. I don't know, you're in the system, so you would know, but does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I mean, nothing makes sense to me, because I certainly don't sit in any board positions, and I don't sit in the CEO or those major positions either, which I'm pretty grateful for, actually. But I mean, let's look at Eskom. Again, another situation. You know, everybody aims at, you know, you look at Andre de Ruyter, you're obviously saying that this guy, is he the right man for the job? Is he doing it right? We see what's happening with the power utility, but we know there's a board sitting above him, and we know that there are lots of directions coming from ministers, the presidencies. Everybody has a say in this. So who do we actually look at to say, well, you're to blame? Are we looking at government institutions? I mean, let's just cut to the chase. Are we looking at individuals within government that are just ruining the management of these organizations and state-owned entities?
Yeah, you've put your finger on it in one sense, is that in order for an entity to operate, it needs the right people in the boardroom. And I would argue the right composition of people in the boardroom. Eskom is in flux, brand new board, trying to get their feet. Eskom is a serious problem at the moment, because we all depend on Eskom. Ultimately, accountability needs to sit with the board, but when there's interference, then we have to hold those interfering accountable. And I think that's the challenge in South Africa right now, is that certainly there has been the capture context, but there's also been the enablement and, in a sense, the continuation of corruption. South Africa, and we all love South Africa, is almost in the emergency room. When we are in the emergency room, who do we want operating on us? We want specialists. We want people who know what they're doing. And that, I think, is the critical thing, is that ultimately we can have, we want competent boards, and we need competent boards. And the moment we have other influences like cadre deployment, political interference, sitting there as a board member with a political interest and not a interest of the entity, that is a problem. Yeah. And that needs to be diagnosed and treated urgently and well if there is going to be any way forward across South Africa. That's the position we're in at the moment.
Roger, if I may, in 30 seconds, because we're already at 7, so I just want to steal this little bit, because it's a big story in terms of many people talking to it. Eskom board member Mteto Nyati talking to and making comments saying that BEE and empowerment rules must go, because this is one of the big problems that's facing SOEs. Do you agree, or was this something that he should never have said?
I would agree. Going back to my metaphor of the lying on the operating table, I want someone who can do the job. Now, I also believe very strongly that we need in South Africa to cultivate a lot of change, without a doubt. But I don't know if engineering it in terms of legislation, regulation, and increasing that is the way to go. You can't keep doing the same thing and get the same result. I mean, that's what's happening. If we want a different result, we've got to change what we're doing. And I do think that there's an opportunity to engage around that and say, what does that look like? Okay. Not just at a legislative point, but actually in our boardrooms. Right. How are boards engaging with these topics and conversations? Highly controversial, so you squeezed it in, but that's my opinion.
Indeed, I did squeeze it in right at the end. I know we have run into time problems, but Roger, thanks for chatting to us. Governance specialist and senior partner at SABC Group, Roger Hitchcock, sharing his perspectives on the state of SOEs in South Africa.